Last month, I got the opportunity to ask the Prime Minister directly why he is excluding the Native Women's Association of Canada from his government's provincial territorial meetings. And he said, quote, "That is simply not true." And yet, in December 2016, Native Women's Association of Canada and the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples were left out of a meeting advancing reconciliation with the Prime Minister. On this conversation about reconciliation, there was not a single Indigenous woman at the table. And in the press conference after the meeting, the Prime Minister confirmed that their exclusion was deliberate. He said, quote, "My answer is that we always have to make choices about who to include in different venues and at different points." He later told the National Observer, quote, "In any given meeting, we have to make choices, and we made those choices." And he has chosen again and again, despite the Prime Minister's commitment to a true nation-to-nation relationship, despite his commitment to feminism, he has excluded First Nations again and again. The Native Women's Association. They were excluded from the First Minister's meetings in October 2017, December 2016, March 2016, and again not invited to participate in the reconciliation meeting I just cited in December 2016. So I would like to know from the representative of the Prime Minister, what is his evidence that he has been inviting the Native Women's Association of Canada to these high-level meetings, these reconciliation meetings, these First Minister meetings, because he told me that I'm saying something that is not true. Quote, "That is simply not true," is what he said to me. And the Prime Minister really is in bad company on this. The mandate letter that he gave to the Minister of Crown, Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs indicated the government's commitment to continue to develop and lead a whole-of-government strategy to include Indigenous representatives in meaningful ways in Canada's federal, provincial, territorial dialogues. And I will submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that if the Prime Minister continues to leave out Indigenous women from these conversations, he is not fulfilling his commitment. The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women indicated its concern that Indigenous women's organizations are not included in Canada's countrywide nation-to-nation relationship on equal footing with other Indigenous peoples' organizations. That report is more than a year old, and it still is not being honored. UN CEDAW recommended that Canada ensure Indigenous women's organizations are included in the countrywide nation-to-nation relationship in all cases in which issues of relevance to women apply. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People asks the government to commit to Article 18, in which Indigenous people have the right to participate in decision-making matters that would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures. The Liberal government says that they're going to agree to my colleague from Abitibi Bay, James Nunavut EU, in his bill, but the actions do not line up with the words. I'd like to hear from the government's representative why they're failing to shut out, continuing to shut out NWAC.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Crown, Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise today to answer the question that has been posed by the Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith. I acknowledge as well that I stand here this evening on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people, a very proud people. The Government of Canada is committed to a renewed relationship with Indigenous people based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. For over 40 years, the Native Women's Association of Canada has played a vital role in empowering Indigenous women and girls, and they continue to do so today. Its goal is to enhance, promote, and foster a greater social, cultural, and economic well-being for Indigenous women from coast to coast to coast. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada has created permanent bilateral mechanisms with the Assembly of First Nations, the First Nations, the Inuit Tapiriti Kanatimi and the 4 Inuit and Nungat regions and the Métis National Council, and its governing members to identify joint priorities and co-develop policies and monitor progress. This does not mean that NWAC does not have a voice or is being excluded, nor does it mean that others in our Indigenous communities do not have a voice. The Government of Canada has committed to working and meeting regularly with the national Indigenous organizations. We are the first to do this, and we will continue to engage in a robust bilateral discussion with all 5 on issues of importance to their members. Our government has shown through our actions and through our continual engagement with the Native Women's Association of Canada over the course of the past year the importance that we have placed on this organization's contribution and perspective. We recognize the critical role that NWAC plays in furthering the journey of reconciliation, and we look forward to walking this path together. True reconciliation cannot be achieved without the full inclusion of all Indigenous people. Canada remains committed to including the distinct perspectives of Indigenous women in all programs, policies, and all legislation. Canada will continue to work with Indigenous women and organizations and others Indigenous groups across the country to ensure that all voices, those of our youth, those of our elders, those of our women, are all heard. When Indigenous women and girls thrive, our nation is stronger and benefits from the talent and the knowledge that they contribute. Our government knows this and remains committed to working with the Native Women's Association of Canada, their strong leadership and board, and other Indigenous women's organizations across Canada. I thank the member today for posing the statement, as it gives us an opportunity to reinforce our commitment to consulting and working with Indigenous women in Canada, especially NWAC, and for also the opportunity to point out that we are the first government to establish the bilateral tables with the leading government bodies for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in Canada. Thank you.
The honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member has continued to state the government's commitment, but has failed to explain why their actions do not align with those statements. Last year, again at the United Nations May session to celebrate UNDRIP, NWAC, Native Women's Association of Canada, asked to be included. They were not. They were barred from the delegation. They couldn't even attend the side events. Last year in December, the president of NWAC, Francine Joe, said, the Prime Minister states he's a feminist, he states Indigenous relations are high priorities, yet he specifically excludes an Indigenous organization that has been recognized by the court. Why? The Prime Minister has not answered my letter on this. I ask again, why are you shutting Native Women's Association out of your highest level government meetings?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, the bilateral table with lead Indigenous governments in Canada, being the Assembly of First Nations, ITK, and the Métis Council of Canada, are the lead umbrella organizations for their governments, for Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people in Canada. We recognize the Native Women's Association of Canada plays an invaluable role as an advocate for Indigenous women. And that's why the Government of Canada seeks to not only acknowledge NWAC as a valued partner, but also to recognize NWAC's vision, their support, and their guidance to so many Indigenous women in Canada. We look to NWAC as a partner in leading the empowerment of Indigenous women in all aspects of Canadian society. And moving forward, the Government of Canada will continue to work in partnership with NWAC and other Indigenous organizations to ensure that all Indigenous voices are heard, including those of women. And together we can create that positive change and ensure that Indigenous women are treated with the same respect as all other women in Canada, the respect that they deserve and the opportunity to have that input that they deserve into the Government of Canada.
Yes.